I understand everybody was happy that I talked about what I talked about last week and our last meeting, whenever it was, and those of you who really liked it, I guess you ought to let me know and give me a little show of support here, so I can justify boring you to tears again. I mean, it's not often that I get to talk about stuff I like to talk about, and somebody else likes listening to it. But we're going to go, kind of deep into it. There's some things that I came across when I was doing my research. I haven't written anything about this yet, except in passing. I've mentioned things, but I've never really gone into it deeply. But I want to talk about Paul and the angels. And what I really want to talk about is where this idea of the angels came from, what it means in a general sense, and in a specific sense. Last time I made a number of allusions to the fact that many things that were in the Pauline theology and in the Gospel of Mark that related to apocalyptic literature was very similar to what the C's have told us over and over again, and in many permutations, talking about hyperdimensional realities, the fact that our reality is either extruded from or a shadow of or created by denizens of some higher reality who interact with us in ways that are not necessarily friendly, although sometimes it can be, and that their relationship to us is similar to our relationship to the animal kingdom on our planet. Now, I discussed this a lot in The Wave. I talked about hyperdimensional awareness, and I discussed a little bit the awareness of animals and, for example, horses and dogs. But I don't think we can really plumb the depths of the disparity between our reality and a hyperdimensional, say, fourth density reality. The C's call it densities, 7 densities. And the first is basically primal matter, rocks and minerals and that sort of thing. And second density is the animal kingdom, and plants and so forth are kind of like a bridge between minerals and rocks and the animal kingdom, because it's at the level of plants that minerals get transformed into energy, or get utilized to transform into energy using sunlight, water, which is a pretty phenomenal act, photosynthesis. And then those plants get eaten by animals, the second density, and also they get eaten by third density, i.e. us. We are supposed to be third density. And then there's fourth density above us, and they supposedly, in some cases, and maybe many cases, we are not even sure, they consume human beings. Now, the literature about human sacrifice to the gods is vast. It's been going on for many thousands of years. It just goes way back into the mists of time. And when you study it in any great detail, you discover that the sacrifice is actually literally supposed to feed the god. And it gets explicit in some cases that the god is fed by the mediation of a form of god, the god of fire, Agni. And this is so in many religious belief systems, that the fire consumes the sacrifice, and the smoke of the sacrifice goes up into the heavens, and the god consumes it and is nourished by it. And in ancient cultures, this was kind of a duty of the human being. The human being was supposed to nourish the god, because the gods would sustain creation and keep chaos at bay as long as they were strengthened, and they were strengthened by human sacrifice. And that's one of the big things that got changed with the onset or the installation of Christianity into our society, our culture, our civilization. Human sacrifice was done away with, except for the fact that it seems that we do a lot of human sacrifice in the way of war. So it's just a different way of getting what they want. If in fact hyperdimensional beings consume human beings, and there is some material evidence available in our world, our reality, and our literature that this does in fact happen. There's also some literature that suggests that hyperdimensional beings can consume substitutes, such as, cattle, whatever. And of course, throughout the history of sacrifice to the gods, animals were also sacrificed in place of human beings. And this was more or less the big thing that came in with, Judaism was all about sacrificing, in place of the human being. You have a sin, you did a sin, you got to go to the temple, you got to sacrifice. And of course, the temple culture was all centered around making money from the sacrifice. At a certain point, some of the priests or some chieftain, somebody said, wait a minute, we can make money from this. And they erected large temples and had farmers bringing in their animals in, and they would sell them to the people coming to make sacrifices. Parts of the animal were designated as for the god, and other parts were designated for the priests, and then what was left over was given back to the sacrificer, who could take it home and eat it. So it was a big economic system. But having said all of that about the possibility of hyperdimensional entities feeding on us and our world, which is a scary enough thought, and a whole lot of the wave is devoted to discussing this and whether or not it's true, and if it's true, how it can be true, and if it is true and we know how it can be true, what the heck it might mean for us. But I want to go back to Paul's idea of the angels, and even further back than that. Now, what I have here, I brought some books, kind of for visual aids and so forth. And some I will be sharing some things with you from these books. Now, the first book is Uruk, the First City. It's a very small book, and it's really, really fascinating. It's by an Italian scholar named Mario Liverani. He acknowledges that Uruk is not any longer considered to be the origin of civilization, that there were multiple places around the globe that could claim to be the origin of civilization, and it kind of happened simultaneously in a lot of different places. But since the documentation for Uruk is so good, he based his study on that. And it also, not only is it because the documentation is so good, it's because Uruk led directly into, by a fairly direct chain of transmission, into our own civilization. So what goes on in our world and the establishment of our world is pretty much based on what was going on in Uruk, going back as far as 4th, 5th millennium BC. That's 3,000-4,000 years before Christ, or before the Common Era. Now, since Liverani wrote this book, there have been discoveries made of places like Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, Turkey. And these places, Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites, have been dated 9, 11, 12 maybe 13,000 years BC. And these are places of monumental architecture that required the cohesion of a group of people that was larger than just a tribe. They were, fairly large cohesive groups in order to construct these things. And they were artistically and technologically sophisticated. So this tells us that there was a lot more going on way, way further in the past than the development of Uruk, supposedly one of the earliest cities of our civilization. Now, the seas have also told us many things, but, I speculated in Secret History about the possible nature of an early civilization that didn't leave the kind of remains that we would expect to see if it were a civilization like our own. Let me give you a little example. Ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Fabulous buildings. Everybody knows, the Parthenon and, the temples in Rome and the buildings in Greece and, the Roman buildings that are left around the Mediterranean world. And everybody thinks, oh, wow, this is awesome. And you read about the Romans, and they had, many advanced systems of a large number of things. But still, they still had fairly primitive religious ideas, primitive from our point of view. Keep that in mind. It may not have been so primitive. And the thing that powered these civilizations of the past was slavery. They were able to build those buildings not because they had cranes, bulldozers, earth movers, excavators, all kinds of sophisticated equipment that ran on gasoline or diesel-powered engines or whatever. They had sheer human body power in tremendous amounts. The entire ancient economy was based on slavery. And it was based on slavery usually due to warfare. If a country lost a war, the winning country went in and took everybody slave. They were all game to become slaves. Entire countries were enslaved, and they were sold, and they were given to the soldiers, and they were given to the generals, and the influx of slaves into Rome after different battles was sometimes so enormous that it would depress the slave market. In other words, there was more supply than there was demand, so you could get slaves a lot more cheaply. Greeks were enslaved by the Romans. Some famous Greeks who were enslaved by Romans left some fantastic writings. So slavery is what ran things. And the slavery had to do with losing wars. And the idea was that if you lost a war, that meant that the god no longer favored you. Your god, my god is red hot, your god ain't diddly squat. So the winning god is the one that's red hot, and the diddly squat god is the one that lost, and therefore all of his people, all of his worshipers, were fair game to become slaves. Now, this began rather early, and in fact, Liverani pretty much shows that the origin of this whole idea, because there was something more egalitarian before that, because before Uruk there wasn't exactly a giant city-state. Now, there was Göbekli Tepe, there were sister sites, and you could see that there were large groups of people that lived in enclaves and had associations with other people, but somehow it never managed to get really humongous and get to the point of super monumental architecture. These other sites, they're monumental up to a point. But when we're talking about Uruk and we're talking about ziggurats, we're talking about gigantic buildings. And they were temples, primarily temples. So somebody at some point came up with the idea that the God was angry and the God needed a lot of food, and it was everybody's best interest to get together and to provide the food for the God. And so they did. And naturally, a bureaucracy arose among those people who were self-proclaimed temple rulers or priests or whatever. And, we're in charge, we speak to the God. And, this was kind of a process. I'm not going to go into it in detail. If you want to know the details, read the book. But eventually, what happened was the temple system got very large, and they began to need to keep track of things, because the idea of that economy was imports. The idea of our economy today is exports. The more we export, that means the more money we have, right? Because you export stuff and they buy it and they get the money. Their idea was, we want stuff, because money wasn't really a concern or consideration. Everything was all about goods. We want stuff, and because the God wants stuff. And so people began bringing their stuff, and then also people were being given tracts of land to work on behalf of the temple, and the temple had to keep track of who was working what land, how much it was supposed to produce from year to year to year. Very detailed analysis, the bottom line being that there had to be a way to keep track of stuff. Now, seals, such as, stamp seals, had existed for a long time. There's a bunch of them from the Mohenjo-Daro down in the Indian Peninsula, continent, whatever you call it, subcontinent. And there were seals of different kinds that were found in other places. And these seals were usually pretty basic. And the idea being expressed that somebody had a seal, they probably had, this thing, and they wore it around their neck, and they used it to stamp clay, and the clay would be attached to some kind of object, and it basically declared ownership. So they owned things, and they stamped it with their seal, and that gave their ownership. So seals began to be used to differentiate large lots of material goods that were being brought to the temple in Uruk. And all of this is known because of archaeology. So this is trying to understand what was going on is what Liverani was working on, but the archaeology is there of what we're talking about here. So they would differentiate, and they would store, and they would make accounting for, and they would keep records. And they would keep records based on seals and number symbols. And after a while, they would put the seal, not only the ownership seal, but they would also put a little token attached to it that said what it is. This is wool, or this is oil, or this is barley, or this is some kind of fabrics or whatever. So there was a token that would be used that was supposed to represent what the object or the group of objects were, a numerical symbol, and ownership. And after a while, instead of just putting all of this inside a little container, which they attached to the larger container that contained the object, they just stamped it on a little piece of clay that was dried, and it was attached. And you could look at the clay and say, okay, there's 50 sheepskins in here. And it was given to the temple by so-and-so based on his seal. And this is what he owed for the year as his taxes, so he's good, he's okay. So after a while, they started realizing that this was a rudimentary form of writing, and that the symbols that represented things could be extended to other things. There could be symbols for other things. And they started making these symbols, and they started creating lexical lists, and they started studying them and sharing them, and everybody, pretty soon, they got to where they were, cuneiform writing was basically born. He's got some visual examples in there that can show you, how some of these cuneiform symbols originally represented something where it actually kind of looked like the thing. So writing developed, and words became important because they began to realize that they could represent words, and they could write lists of words. And they got the idea that words came from the gods, that words represented the essence of things, and that there were also words that could represent many other different things because they sounded similar. And in this case, I think I'm going to give you a little example of that because it was kind of funny how it was, and I hope I can find it. He's got a little graph here. He says the development of the sizes of temples and of houses. All right, can you see that graph? See this number, see this line that goes up like that, and see this line that goes like that. Okay, this line is the size of houses, and this line is the size of temples. And look at how they grew, really, humongous. And that was right at 4,000 BC. So what makes one wonder, just what the heck was going on there, why they suddenly became really afraid of the gods, and why they suddenly decided they had to have temples to store the goods that were needed to make sure the gods were happy. The whole thing is that once they got words going on, everything took off and life changed dramatically for the beginnings of this civilization. And at that point, you go to this book, and this might be the one that has it. Philosophy Before the Greeks. Now this guy is by Mark van Dimmeroop. So now what he writes about in extensive detail is what the Babylonians did with writing. They made lists of words, and they made the majority of the possibly millions of clay tablets that have been unearthed deal with keeping track of materials donated to the temple, lands owned by the temple being farmed by somebody else, all these other things. But all the rest are lexical and trying to figure out how the world worked through the permutations of words. Okay, here's our example. What they did with these lists of words, the connection between prostases and apodoses. Now, prostases and apodoses is a statement that if there are 4 palace gates, there will be an uprising of a usurper king. If a hole is situated in the presence of whoever, the fully loaded boat will sink, or a pregnant woman will die in labor. Now, we would call these like little prophetic things, that if such and such is noticed, such and such will happen. It's like what we would call superstitious reading of the environment. Okay, so one could read the words in the protasis, which is the if statement. If a crack is in the sidewalk, you'll break your mother's back. And that's the apodosis. Okay. One could read the words literally, but also interpret the cuneiform signs used to write them by varying their readings in the same way that the authors of the Babylonian creation myth developed the names of the god Marduk. The 2 parts of the omen were thus relatively simple. With a few exceptions, both protasis and apodosis made straightforward statements that were often very exact in nature. The casuistic format of the omen lists made it possible to restrict individual entries to specific occurrences. But what connected the 2 parts? Why was a certain protasis the sign of a particular apodosis? For the system to have any credibility to its users, there had to be a valid connection. And while we cannot now understand its rationality in detail, and probably never will, we should appreciate its coherence. Modern astronomy tells us, for example, that most omens concerning the planet Jupiter in the series of the Enuma, Anu, and Lil are impossible, as the planet never crosses paths with the fixed stars mentioned. This should not lead us to think that the Babylonians who formulated them were ignorant of the fact. They also mentioned the appearance of the sun in the middle of the night. Now, right there, everybody, I'm sure, is thinking, well, maybe they did see the sun in the middle of the night. If they had, like fireballs and comets and so forth landing on the Earth, and maybe Jupiter, did cross planets of so-called fixed stars if they weren't so fixed. When the genre of omen lists originated in the early second millennium, each statement read, if, blah, 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 then. In the first millennium, the conditional if was dropped and protasis and apodosis were listed side by side, introduced by vertical check marks. The statement became X, then Y. X implies Y. The omens drew conclusions expressed in the apodoses from established premises stated in the protasis. A scientific logic that was consistent throughout the myriad single cases. When we look at omens as expressions of inferential logic, it becomes irrelevant whether or not their content was possible. They function at the level of metaphysical rather than physical possibility. This fact invalidates one of the common explanations of the relationship between them, empirical observation, and at the same time removes the apprehension about the absurdity of many omens. Well, we may think that he probably didn't know what was going on. But anyway, so many parallels remain obscure, and the text shows how some of them came about through elaboration. In the lexical list, the first 4 lines of a tablet contain these pairs. Arictu equals success, length, success. Alictu, looseness, equals kasutu, success. Usurtu, looseness, kasutu, success. Susurtu, straightness. Sakat nakri, routing the enemy. The authors were clearly playing around with homonyms because arictu is the protasis, meaning success, in the apodosis, and its homonym, alictu, did so as well. So they would take words that sounded the same and so forth. Now, you're wondering what this has to do with angels. They were making these lists of words. They were exploring the permutations of words that sounded the same or had at least one syllable that sounded the same for thousands of years. They were creating these omen lists where if blah, 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 then blah, 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 or this equals that for thousands of years. Now, Van der Meerup is not too sure that they were doing empirical observation. I'm not so sure about that because in so many other ways, the Babylonians did a lot of empirical observation. A lot of their science was observation-based. So they must have been observing some really strange things, and reading these kinds of texts is, it can be tedious, but it's also fascinating because you're trying to put your head into their frame of reference and figure out what the heck they were seeing. What were they talking about? So they made lists, and they discerned qualities, and they made omens, and so on and so forth. Okay. Enter the Jews going into exile in Babylon. They go there, and they are, introduced to this kind of activity. Some of them even trained to be scribes. And if you trained to be a scribe in those times, and this guy explains what the career was and how much you had to learn. You had to practically memorize thousands of lists of words. So the Jews get over there and they are exposed to this kind of activity, and they start working with that. And they start, and it has an impression on them. And then the next thing that happens is, after a certain number of years, the Persians come and they overthrow the Babylonians almost without firing a shot, if they had a shot to fire. Along with the Persians came Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism, in addition to having, the usual group of gods and demigods and subgods and so forth, they had all kinds of angels and devas and so on. And they had the concept of the end of the world. And that's something I wrote about in From Paul to Mark, how there was a northern group of myths and a southern group of myths. So you've got the southern group of myths there with the Babylonians and the Jews, basically. And then all of a sudden they're introduced to the northern group of myths through the Persians. And what that did was they began to make lists too. They imitated what the Babylonians were doing with their word lists and their omen lists. They applied, when they finally developed the Old Testament or their different scriptures, they applied some of these methods to analyzing the text and using the words. But more than that, they made lists of angels. And I'm not entirely sure where specifically they got it. I'm pretty sure they got it from the Persians, but it's hard to say because you're really back in the dark depths of history here. And of course the question is, was somebody really seeing something? But anyway, if you put together what Liverani writes about the earliest city and the development of writing, and then why it was developing, the building of the temple, the increase of the size in temples, the taking control of literally everything, the whole society, by a bureaucratic group of priests for an economic reason. And in fact, spreading their influence so far and wide that they had, tens of thousands of people gathered together. I mean, the first real city from our perspective where there was a really lot of people all together and they were supporting a temple, and the temple was then able to support artisans and to create trade networks because they would use some of this substance that they had acquired to train artisans and to get them to produce things, to provide them with goods to take to trade so that they could get more stuff from other countries. So it was really all kind of like an economic thing. So writing actually came to be for economic reasons. But then it was turned to this esoteric thing where words had mystical powers, as you could see from permutating words, and that it meant success because it had this homonymic sound. So then the Jews came, and then the Persians came, and then all of a sudden, out of all of this mess, you get First Enoch. So, anyway, there's a long footnote in From Paul to Mark that gives you the background on the book itself. Is one of the things that did not make the cut when I was writing the book, because if I'd written about Enoch, we would probably have had about 100 more pages of book. Here it is. The Book of Enoch, ascribed to the great-grandfather of Noah, is an apocalyptic text. Its oldest sections probably date to 300, 200 BC, and its latest to around 100 BC. Its peculiar themes include the fallen angels who came onto the earth to unite with human women and are considered responsible for the spread of evil and impurity on the earth. The absence in First Enoch of formal parallels to the specific laws and commandments found in the Mosaic Torah, and of references to issues like Sabbath observance or the rite of circumcision. The concept of end of days as the time of final judgment that takes place of promises of earthly rewards, the rejection of the second temple sacrifices considered impure, the presentation of heaven, not in terms of the Jerusalem temple and its priests, but modeling God and its angels on an ancient Near Eastern or Hellenistic court. So you also realize, don't you, that this business of making lists and permutations of words and imagining that these kinds of activities produce some kind of magical effects is probably behind the idea of Kabbalah and Kabbalistic exercises and magic in general. Okay, the Book of Watchers. The words of the blessing with which Enoch blessed the righteous chosen, who will be present on the day of tribulation to remove all the enemies, and the righteous will be saved. And this is a very northern myth idea. It's very Zoroastrian. And he took up his discourse and said, Enoch, a righteous man whose eyes were opened by God, who had the vision of the Holy One and of heaven, which he showed me. From the words of the watchers and holy ones I heard everything, and as I heard everything from them, I also understood what I saw. Not for this generation do I expound, but concerning one that is distant I speak, and concerning the chosen I speak now, and concerning them I take up my discourse. So he's establishing his bona fides here, and he's saying, I'm writing this for somebody in the future, but this is really written at the time of Enoch. It's like retroactive continuity. The great Holy One will come forth from his dwelling, and the eternal God will tread from thence upon Mount Sinai. Not Zion, Sinai. He will appear with his army. He will appear with his mighty host from the heaven of heavens. All the watchers will fear and quake, and those who are hiding in the ends of the earth will sing. All the ends of the earth will be shaken, and trembling and great fear will seize them, the watchers, that is. The high mountains will be shaken and fall and break apart, and the high hills will be made low and melt like wax before the fire. The earth will be wholly rent asunder, and everything on the earth will perish, and there will be judgment on all. With the righteous he will make peace, and over the chosen there will be protection, and upon them there will be mercy. They will all be God's, and he will grant them his good pleasure. He will bless them all, and he will help them all. Light will shine upon them, and he will make peace with them. Look, he comes with myriads of his holy ones to execute judgment on all, and to destroy all the wicked, and to convict all humanity for all the wicked deeds that they have done, and the proud and hard words that wicked sinners spoke against him. Boy, wouldn't we like to write stuff like that nowadays and believe that it was going to happen. Contemplate all his words and observe the works of heaven, how they do not alter their paths, and the luminaries of heaven, that after they all rise and set, each one ordered in its appointed time. And they appear on their feasts and do not transgress their own appointed order. Observe the earth and contemplate the works that take place on it from the beginning until the consummation, that nothing on earth changes, but all the works of God are manifest to you. Observe the signs of summer and winter. Contemplate the signs of winter, that all the earth is filled with water, and clouds and dew and rain rest upon it. Contemplate and observe how all the trees appear withered, and how all the leaves are stripped, except 14 trees that are not stripped, which remain with the old until the new come after 2 or 3 years. I have no idea what trees they're talking about. Observe the signs of summer, whereby the sun burns and scorches, and you seek shelter and shade from its presence. And the earth burns with scorching heat, and you are unable to tread on the dust or the rock because of the burning. Contemplate all the trees, their leaves blossom green on them, and they cover the trees, and all their fruit is for glorious honor. Contemplate all those works and understand that he who lives for all the ages made all these works. And his works take place from year to year, and they all carry out their works for him, and their works do not alter, but they all carry out his word. Observe how in like manner the sea and the rivers carry out and do not alter their works from his words. But you have not stood firm, nor acted according to his commandments. You have turned aside. You have spoken proud and hard words with your unclean mouth against his majesty. Hard of heart, there will be no peace for you. Then you will curse your days, and the years of your life will perish. And the years of your destruction will increase in an eternal curse, and there will be no mercy or peace for you. Then you will leave your names as an eternal curse for all the righteous, and by you all who curse will be cursed. And all the sinners and wicked will swear by you, and all the chosen will rejoice. And for them there will be forgiveness of sins, and all mercy and peace and clemency. For them there will be salvation, a good light, and they will inherit the earth. But for all your sinners there will be no salvation. But on all of you a curse will abide. For the chosen there will be light and joy and peace, and they will inherit the earth. But for you wicked there will be a curse. Then wisdom will be given to all the chosen, and they will all live, and they will sin no more through godlessness or pride. In the enlightened man there will be light, and the wise man understanding, and they will transgress no more, nor will they sin all the days of their life, nor will they die in the heat of God's wrath. But the number of the days of their life they will complete, and their life will grow in peace, and the years of their joy will increase in rejoicing in eternal peace all the days of their life. When the sons of men had multiplied in those days, beautiful and comely daughters were born to them, and the watchers, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. And they said to one another, Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the daughters of men, and let us beget children for ourselves. And Shemihazah, their chief, said to them, I fear that you will not want to do this deed, and I alone shall be guilty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and let us all bind one another with a curse, that none of us turn back from this counsel until we fulfill it and do the deed. Then they all swore together and bound one another with a curse. And they were all of them 200 who descended in the days of Jared onto the peak of Mount Hermon. And they called the mountain Hermon because they swore and bound one another with a curse on it. And these are the names of their chiefs. Shemihazah, this one was their leader. Artikoph, second to him. Remeshel, third to him. Kokabel, fourth to him. Armumahel, fifth to him. Ramel, sixth to him. Daniel, seventh to him. Zikel, eighth to him. Barakel, ninth to him. Asael, 10th to him. Hermani, 11th to him. Matarel, 12th to him. Ananel, 13th to him. Setuel, 14th to him. Samshiel, 15th to him. Sariel, 16th to him. Tumiel, 17th to him. Turiel, 18th to him. Yamiel, 19th to him. Yehadiel, 20th to him. These are the chiefs of 10. So they've got 20, and each of these 20 is the head of 10 other of the fallen angels. And this is where you see and the Jews making lists, using these words with the homophonic sounds. Okay. These and all the others with them took for themselves wives from among them, such as they chose. And they began to go into them and to defile themselves through them, and to teach them sorcery and charms, and to reveal to them the cutting of roots and plants. And they conceived from them and bore to them great giants, and the giants begot Nephilim, and to the Nephilim were born Eliud, and they were growing in accordance with their greatness. They were devouring the labor of all the sons of men, and men were not able to supply them. And the giants began to kill men and to devour them. And they began to sin against the birds and the beasts and creeping things and the fish, and to devour one another's flesh. and they drank the blood. Then the earth brought accusations against the lawless ones. Asael taught men to make swords of iron and weapons and shields and breastplates and every instrument of war. He showed them metals of the earth and how they should work gold to fashion it suitably, and concerning silver to fashion it for bracelets and ornaments for women. And he showed them concerning antimony and eye paint and all manner of precious stones and dyes. And the sons of men made for themselves and for their daughters, and they transgressed and led the holy ones astray. And there was much godlessness on the earth, and they made their ways desolate. Shemi-Haza taught spells and the cutting of roots. Hermione taught sorcery for the loosing of spells and magic and skill. Barakel taught the signs of the lightning flashes. Kokabel taught the signs of the stars. Zichel taught the signs of the shooting stars. Ardikoff taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the signs of the moon. And they all began to reveal mysteries to their wives and to their children. And as men were perishing, the cry went up to heaven. Then Michael and Sariel and Raphael and Gabriel looked down from the sanctuary of heaven upon the earth, and saw much bloodshed on the earth. All the earth was filled with the godlessness and violence that had befallen it. And entering in, they said to one another, the earth devoid of inhabitants raises the voice of their cries to the gates of heaven. And now to us, the holy ones of heaven, the souls of men make suit, saying, bring in our judgment to the Most High, and our destruction before the glory of the Majesty, before the Lord of all lords of majesty. Approaching, they said to the Lord of the ages, you are the God of gods and Lord of lords and King of kings and God of the ages. And the throne of your glory exists for every generation of the generations that are from old. And your name is holy and great and blessed for all the ages, for you have made all things and have authority over all. And all things are manifest and uncovered before you, and you see all things, and there is nothing that can be hidden from you. You see what Asael has done, who has taught all the iniquity on the earth, and has revealed the eternal mysteries that are in heaven, which the sons of men were striving to learn. And what Shemi-Haza has done, to whom you gave authority to rule over them who are with him. They have gone into the daughters of the men of earth, and they have lain with them, and have defiled themselves with women. And they have revealed to them all the sins, and have taught them to make hate-inducing charms. And now look, the daughters of men have borne sons from them, giants, half-breeds. And the blood of men is shed on the earth, and the whole earth is filled with iniquity. And now look, the spirits of the souls of the men who have died make suit. Their groan has come up to the gates of heaven, and it does not cease to come forth from the presence of the iniquities that have been set upon the earth. You know all things before they happen, and you see these things, and you permit them, and you do not tell us what we ought to do to them with regard to these things. So that's what the four archangels are saying basically to God. Then the Most High declared, and the great Holy One spoke. And he sent Sariel to the son of Lamech, saying, go to Noah and say to him in my name, hide yourself, and reveal to him that the end is coming, that the whole earth will perish. And tell him that a deluge is about to come on the whole earth and destroy everything on the earth. Teach the righteous one what he should do, the son of Lamech, how he may preserve himself alive and escape forever. From him a plant will be planted, and his seed will endure for all the generations of eternity. To Raphael he said, go, Raphael, and bind Asael hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the wilderness that is in Dudael. Throw him there and lay beneath him sharp and jagged stones. and cover him with darkness, and let him dwell there for an exceedingly long time. Cover up his face, and let him not see the light. And on the day of the great judgment he will be led away to the burning conflagration, and heal the earth, which the watchers have desolated, and announce the healing of the earth, that the plague may be healed. And all the sons of men may not perish because of the mystery that the watchers told and taught their sons. And all the earth was made desolate by the deeds of the teaching of Asael, and over him write all their sins. And to Gabriel he said, Go, Gabriel, to the bastards, to the half-breeds, to the sons of miscegenation, and destroy the sons of the watchers from among the sons of men, and send them against one another in a war of destruction. Length of days they will not have, and no petition will be granted to their fathers in their behalf, that they should expect to live in everlasting life, nor even that each of them should live 500 years. And to Michael he said, Go, Michael, bind Shemihaza and the others with him, who have mated with the daughters of men, so that they were defiled by them in their uncleanness. And when their sons perish and they see the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, until the day of their judgment and consummation, until the everlasting judgment is consummated. Then they will be led away to the fiery abyss, and to the torture, and to the prison, where they will be confined forever. And everyone who is condemned and destroyed henceforth will be bound together with them until the consummation of their generation. And at the time of the judgment which I shall judge, they will perish for all generations. Destroy all the spirits of the half-breeds and the sons of the watchers, because they have wronged men. Now, they're not just killing them, they're destroying their spirits. Destroy all perversity from the face of the earth, and let every wicked deed be gone. And let the plant of righteousness and truth appear, and it will become a blessing. And the deeds of righteousness and truth will be planted forever with joy. And so on, and goes on about how everybody's going to become righteous after the flood of Noah, because Noah's going to survive. And now there you have heard what the Jews did with some of the ideas they obtained from the Babylonians and from the Persians. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, what's his name? Josephus says that one of the jobs of the Qumran community was to keep and control the lists of the angels, to know it and keep it. We know that the Book of Enoch was very familiar to the people at Qumran, to the Essenes, according to, as Josephus called them, because several copies and fragments and so forth were found among the scrolls that were discovered there. Now, of course, what we want to ask about at this point, before I go on, is how much of this was real? I mean, how much of these other realities that are being described in this literature was apocalyptically revealed? That's a very good question. And now we come to this where we get a few more explanations, and we're going to connect it up with Paul. And here, these are some quotes directly from Paul to Mark, so if you're really impressed by all this, you can just go out and get the book and read it yourself. One of the problems of biblical scholarship and biblical understanding among the laity is that the books of the Bible aren't arranged in chronological order. If early Christian texts were arranged in the proper order without the exclusion of the so-called extra-canonical works, it would be possible for people to read them without the late and prejudicially complete story of Matthew in the first place, followed by the earliest of the Gospels, Mark, which comes off looking like a poor Cliff Notes copy made by someone in a hurry. If the Pauline letters were placed where they should be first, even before the Gospels, it would be easy to see how the idea of a Son of God Savior was first brooded by Paul, and then how other writings developed this idea, adding to it and expanding it as time went by. And if Paul's letters were preceded by the Book of Enoch and other apocalypses, it would be easy to see where some of his ideas came from. And remember, a long discussion about the Book of Enoch didn't make it into Paul to Mark. I'll have to do that separately because it would have taken 100 pages. In his most explicit statement about the death of Jesus, Paul attributes it to the demonic powers that rule the lower heaven. And he said, "Yet among the mature we do speak wisdom, though it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to perish. But we speak God's wisdom, secret and hidden, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." Just to be clear what the rulers of this age are that Paul is talking about, consider this. "For our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places." It is apparent that Paul regarded his Jesus as a divine being who incarnated as a human with the plan that he would die in a sacrificial way and thereby save all of mankind from enslavement to demonic powers that were rulers of the age. And we know who they were. We just read a short list of 20 of the top guys. Paul was entirely uninterested in any idea of a Messiah who was merely the Savior of Israel. Brandon tells us that so transcendental a conception of Jesus, integrated into an esoteric soteriology, unparalleled in contemporary Jewish thought, should have developed within some 2 decades of his crucifixion by the Romans, constitutes one of the fundamental problems in the study of Christian origins. Well, certainly the building blocks of the idea already existed in Paul's milieu, as Richard Carey has demonstrated. There were ubiquitous dying, rising gods and apocalyptic visions of the different levels of heaven and so forth that we know about from the literature that has survived. How much more might there have been in the literature that was not preserved? But Paul certainly did put it all together in a unique way. From the beginning, Paul presented Jesus to the Gentiles as a divine being whose true role transcended the Jews and historical circumstances of any earthly life. And here we consider the idea of apocalypticism itself. Apocalypticism is ancient, Near and Middle Eastern, scribally written protest literature, which focuses on the loss of native kingship and expresses a phantasmagoric rectification thereof, particularly in terms of cosmic symbolism, syncretistically redeployed from ancient Near and Middle Eastern cosmologies. So basically, a lot of this protest literature was drawing upon the literature of Zoroastrianism, of the Babylonians, and it was being reframed. Apocalypses are usually pseudonymous and retrojected into the past. They claim to be authored by holy men of ancient times and followed a general archaizing tendency of the times when people wrote texts in an old-fashioned style. It would be like someone of our time writing a text in the style of Shakespeare or even Chaucer, in an effort to convince readers that it really was written back in those times. The authors of these texts wanted their works to be accepted as true. They wanted them to be understood as divine inspiration, and one of the ruses they used was to claim that when the revelation had originally been made, God had stipulated that they were to be kept secret until the time was right for them to be published. And you saw that, you heard that right there at the beginning part of the first book of Enoch. The apocalyptists did their utmost to make their books look genuine. They took care never to mention by name any individual who lived after the time of the supposed authors. There is no mistaking the element of conscious contrivance, of deliberate pretense. Nevertheless, when one reads these works, it seems clear that their authors regarded them as, in some sense, genuine. These men seem to have thought of their writings not only as supplementing biblical prophecy, but as surpassing it, and of themselves not merely as successors of, but as superior to the prophets. Behind the pronouncements of the prophets, they imply, lay a hidden meaning, which was understood only imperfectly by the prophets themselves. Only to the few sages had God given that meaning fully, and only now, with the unsealing of the writings of those sages, would the true import of biblical prophecy be made plain. The symbolic language is traditional. It is largely derived from ancient myths, and unlike biblical prophecy, apocalyptic literature is a learned genre, and the smell of midnight oil pervades it. Yet, when every qualification is made, it seems inconceivable that without some real, compelling visions, the apocalypses would ever have been written down at all. The revelations the apocalyptists received from God were very different from the revelations received by biblical prophets. There is no suggestion in the apocalypses that human beings can, by their obedience or disobedience, affect the shape of things to come. The future is already determined. In fact, its course is already inscribed in a heavenly book, and its outcome will be different from anything foretold in classical prophecy. There will be a final judgment. There will be an afterlife when human beings, including the resurrected dead, will receive their just rewards and punishments. And if some human beings will be transformed into angels, some angels will be condemned to everlasting torment. To the prophets, God had spoken directly, but since their time, God had become more remote. When he communicated with the apocalyptist, it was almost invariably through an intermediary, an angel. Though angels are not unknown in the Hebrew Bible, it is only in the apocalypses that they become major actors. The book of Daniel was written probably shortly after 164 BC, which was the last event that it foretold. The purpose of establishing some verisimilitude was to lead up to the plan, the victory of Judas Maccabee. It was not just the freeing of the Jews and reestablishing a national government. It was a cosmic revolution in which the living would be clothed in glory and the dead would be resurrected. This prophecy is a complete break with the traditional Israelite notion of death. Sheol, the pit, land of oblivion, which was the destiny of all, rich and poor, righteous and unrighteous. So in other words, apocalypses were political texts as much as they were religious, reflecting the idea that when a God's true representative is in power, all is good. The chaos of foreign rule and contrast necessitates a divine reordering, where God is brought back. This is the outlook of the Jewish rebels in Josephus' wars. Later on, the Gnostics concluded that it wasn't just foreign rule, it must be the wrong gods were in charge. So, the point about this is, now, we have the C's material, and I think it would be fairly safe to say that it is apocalyptic literature. It's revealed. It's very often political in nature. They talk about levels. They talk about what could be termed the equivalent of demons, of angels, benevolent beings, and very, very wicked beings. And these all have their correspondence in the apocalyptic literature of the past. And as some of these scholars have pointed out, they don't think it was entirely entirely made up. There was some part of it, this reality, that must have been real, must have been understood as real. Paul was clearly familiar with the Book of Enoch, and we talked last time about the fact that in the Qumran literature and the other apocalyptic writings, it's said that you can't really have an effect on what's coming. Good people are selected and bad people are selected. They are what they are from birth. Blindness of the eye, dullness of the ear, people who can see or hear. And that a battle is taking place within the human being, very much as Paul described it, between the spirit and the flesh. And some people belong to the dark side. So Paul, he talks about, I know a man who in the flesh was taken into, had a vision and was taken up to the third heaven. And right there, Paul tells us that he was extremely familiar with this literature and was influenced by it. And his demons and his angels were pretty much as they were described in the Book of Enoch. So if you want to understand what kinds of things Paul had read and what he thought about, you have only to read the Book of Enoch. Now, we come back again. Was it real? Consider the story of the Watchers. And the story of the Watchers, of angels who fell and mated with human women and produced giants that then became the Nephilim. And remember some of the strange questions and answers that we had with the seas many years ago when I asked about, I think it started when I asked about the statues on Easter Island, what did they represent? And the sea said the Nephilim. And that kind of blew me away. And then there were a number of discussions about the Nephilim and the fact that they were giants and how tall they were and efforts to have them reproduce with human beings that failed, and that they were like enforcers, and also suggesting that there were some coming this way at our present time. So there's some things in the story of the Watchers that kind of match some of the things the sea said about Nephilim, and just to let you know, nobody at the board at the time that those questions were being asked had ever yet read the Book of Enoch, or even heard of it, I don't think. I think we might want to consider that when the Babylonians began their process of word permutations and lists and making their omen lists, they probably were observing some kind of synchronicities in the environment. And this kind of activity was then passed along to the Jews and other peoples, and they began working with these kinds of things, and then they were introduced to the Persians, and somewhere in there the Persians gave them the idea of lists of angels or making lists of angels, and perhaps they just took Zoroastrianism and extrapolated on the theme and made their own lists of angels. You notice that nearly all their named angels, that the name ends in El, which was, the name of the high god for the Jews for a very long period of time. Israel, Israel. So, was any of this real? I think to some extent it was. And of course, the really scary part of it was it talks about how bad it gets and how they got into cannibalism, and the Nephilim were taking all of the produce and the result of the labors of human beings and consuming it and using it up, and then human beings were turning against each other and being killed in mass numbers by the greed and the rapaciousness of the Nephilim. And I think we could probably compare that to what's going on in our world today, because, I don't know how many of you have read about it, but there are some of the leftist libtard types associated with Soros and Schwab and Bill Gates and all of those people who have suggested that we may just have to go to cannibalism because, if we're going to have food to eat. So they're already suggesting those things. They're already taking all the fruits of the labors of the masses of humanity and putting it in their pockets and putting it in their banks. And you could say that, metaphorically speaking, everything that was described about the rule of the Watchers is happening in our world today. So yeah, you could say that the Seas material is very much apocalyptic literature because it exposes all of those things. Now, the Seas have told us that, things will happen a certain way. They've told us that there's not much we can do to change anything. We can change ourselves and make sure that we are in a fit situation when certain things happen. And they've talked about, cometary impacts or collapses or oncoming ice ages, any number of things. We don't know any specific order of these things, when or if they are going to happen. I have the feeling that within 2 years we're going to have a really something's going to, because it can't go on the way it is. It can't go on the way it is. I mean, it's just 2 more years of the burden that's been laid on human beings as it has thus far, and something's going to break. We also know that the world isn't going to end, that things are going to just continue to go on, but there are always violent overturnings of things. We've been told that there is going to be a level playing field at a certain point. Now, the only way I can see the playing field becoming level is if the powers that be are deprived of their power, their money, their control, their electronics, their computers, their guns, their missiles, all of those things. So that would create a level playing field. So that suggests that that we can draw an inference from that statement that there will be a level playing field. That we can infer from that something is going to happen that's going to level that playing field. We don't know what it is exactly. I mean, 25 years ago, the Seas were telling us that things were going to happen exactly as they've been happening since 2014. 2014 was the beginning, when that whole mess went down in Ukraine. And they've told us repeatedly, little clues, little hints here and there. They warned us specifically, they practically said the word about the whole COVID nonsense, and probably 3 months or a month before it all started coming down.
They said things were going to get interesting.
Yeah, so things are pretty interesting, and I think we can consider that some of this ancient literature is telling us things that are important, but they are telling us in the terms that they knew and they understood, the words that they had. The Seas can talk about hyperdimensional beings. They talk about third heaven. They talk about angels and demons, and they talk about giants and so forth. The Seas have given us different terms and terminology for that. The Seas have talked about hybridizing breeding programs that have been undertaken by ultra-terrestrial types, and that some individuals are being continuously replaced on the world stage with what we could only call something similar to a clone. If that's happening, there's no way we can prove or disprove that statement, but there certainly are a lot of strange things that happen. I mean, geez, how long can George Soros live, for God's sakes? We are in the middle of an apocalypse. We have apocalyptic literature. We have things revealed to us. As everyone knows, we prefer to take those revelations and research them and to discuss them and to set them aside and to wait and see to find out what is or is not validated by some other source, preferably some material event, some hard 3D evidence. We get that quite often. Sometimes we don't. But I would say that at this point in time, they have been more right than they have ever been wrong. They haven't been wrong that much. A few times. And we might just as well pay attention and look at some of these things and consider these things and maybe even derive some clues about some of these things from the ancient literature. Perhaps we can learn something from the books of Enoch. I wouldn't, understand it was protest literature. It was political. They wanted their immediate persecutors to be killed and done away with, just like we want Hillary Clinton to be tried and put in jail. That's what they're their equivalent of Hillary Clinton. So let us consider reading some of these things and understanding some of these things and realizing that we are not separated from our past. There is a long and continuing history and connection, and we have been blessed. We have been given our own revelation for this time that is similar to the revelation Paul had for his time, the revelation Zoroaster had for his time. The revelations of Enoch, we don't know all the specifics about it. That would require some research. So we can't, but we know that what he was talking about in terms of esoteric levels of reality, of beings that occupy these other levels of reality, that there was certainly some amazing correspondence between those descriptions and descriptions that we have gotten from the seas, and also descriptions we have gotten from other literature, from our own civilization, our own society. I mean, there's a lot of literature that supports these things. The legends and myths and in more recent times, many stories of alien abductions, of UFOs, of people seeing things in underground bases. There's a vast body of literature, and reading through it and picking out what is possibly valid and what isn't, could take years, but it's fascinating. So anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about tonight, was Paul's angels, what he meant by his angels. And he had visions himself. He was a visionary. His visions were probably very much in line with what is in the Book of Enoch. What's in the Book of Enoch is very much in line with what we have received from the seas. Paul's theological constructs are very similar to what we have received from the seas in terms of service to others, service to self. So I think it's safe to say we're probably on the right track. We can adjust here and there. We can study. We can research. That's what we do. We don't take anything as, absolute given. We always network. We always question. But we are up against some really ugly times in the future, I think. Because if it has to get as bad as it got during the time of the Watchers for
when was that?
God.
When was that?
Just prior to the flood of Noah.
When was that?
Well, the flood of Noah, according to one researcher who tried to pin it down, was 8,000 something BC. So that puts it right around the time of the onset of the Younger Dryas? Yeah, the Younger Dryas cooling event. which was probably 2,000 years after the big.
The Younger Dryas is 12,900 years BP. Before
Okay, the Younger Dryas started 12,900 years BP, before present. So that's about the time of the flood of Noah. So, apparently, if anything of that is true, if there was any revelation really going on there, things have to get really dire before the souls of the people who have died and been tortured or whatever, create such a cry to heaven that something responds. I'm not going to say that the archangels are going to go before the throne of God, but I do think that for every action there are reactions, and there are things that are magnetic, and there are things that are attractive, and there are things that are, that obviously bring other things to pass because, just like a magnet. And places, electromagnetic energies and so forth. So,
universal law.
What?
A universal law.
Yeah. So, it's like gravity. Solid matter.
balance.
You kick a brick, you break your toe. So, all of this endless violation of the free will of human beings is going to result in some karmic blowback, I think, on the perpetrators. So we can continue enjoying our apocalyptic literature, our protest literature, and doing what we can to improve ourselves and make ourselves so that things will skip us, so to speak. I don't know if we can do much more than that. It's not where you are, it's who you are and what you see. Remember that? It's not where you are, it's who you are and what you see. If you have eyes to see and ears to hear, you see the unseen, then you will undoubtedly be where you're supposed to be. So, okay, that's it. Now, any questions?
Michael was asking if it also aligns with Plato's stories of destruction of Timaeus.
If what?
If the 8000 BC, it also has to do with Plato's destruction of Timaeus.
Well, I think it was pretty much in the same time frame. Yeah, the destruction, what they call the destruction of Atlantis. But there was more than one destruction.
There were three.
There were three main destructions. So you have to read Pierre's book about, he's pinning those things down into pretty fine categories of events, using some scientific research, and he does graphs and pictures so you can understand it easy. So read that. But it's connected.
Could the mechanism be that the suffering of humans feeds the STS and they gain power, and then the STO has to rebalance this increase of power in STS?
That's possibly part of it. Yeah. I mean, the C's told us that hyperdimensional bad guys feed on our suffering, and they cause us to suffer to kind of absorb the aroma of our misery, and it feeds them in some kind of psychic way, which is one of the good reasons to figure out your life so that you can stop suffering. Whatever you have to do, because as long as you're suffering, you're feeding negative entities. What else?
Could global warming, quote, pandemics, etc., be considered today's apocalyptic literature?
What? Who wrote that?
Fallen.
Who?
Fallen.
Why would the global warming be apocalyptic literature?
Just a sub-religion for today's science and politics. Don't even know what he meant by that.
Apocalyptic literature is revealed. The whole thing about global warming is the idea that the planet is going to warm and it's a bad thing, and it's going to get so hot that people like Bill Gates and his gang are thinking about shooting things into the atmosphere to shade the earth. Meanwhile, the seas, on the other hand, who have a much better track record than Bill Gates, have said, yes, there's global warming. They were talking about it back in, 96, 97, whatever. But the global warming always inevitably leads to global cooling. There's always a rebound, a glacial rebound. So the fact is if all we had was global warming, we would be able to produce way more food because you have sunshine, you have warming, there's ways to do it.
CO2.
And yeah, CO2, feeds plants. So they're going about a completely bad cycle. So I wouldn't call that apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is literature that is revealed, where something is being revealed. Apocalypse means veil, pulling back the veil. Would you say that being lied to about global warming is having a veil pulled back for you to reveal something to you? No.
Well, it's a corrupted. It could be called a corrupted.
Well, it's a corruption of what's going on.
People getting hysterical.
Yeah, people getting hysterical about global warming when
because they feel there's something coming on. They feel there's something in the offing. Things are going down the toilet, and they want to put a name on it, and they get it wrong, right?
But in terms of literature, it's almost the opposite to apocalyptic.
Yeah, it's almost like trying to cover things up. But it's funny if you think about it. You think about the dream that Joseph had in Egypt, where he interpreted the dream of the Pharaoh, I believe, and he dreamed about the 7 years of great harvest, and then followed by 7 years of famine. And so Joseph interpreted it. And we are in a period where we could, if we would settle down and apply our minds to it, and people would, if the powers that be would allow us to capitalize on what's going on, we could produce great harvests that would carry us into an ice age, and learn ways to survive in an ice age. But they're not doing that. So that's neither here nor there. Next.
It seems that there are two forms of sacrifice we're talking about here. There's the bloody kind done to feed jealous gods, which goes on today. But then there's the kind where we undertake an effort to sacrifice our flesh in service of the spirit and go through a great deal of pain in order to see the unseen. And by flesh, I mean our false personality, mechanical nature, etc.
Well, yeah. Well, there's completely different kinds of sacrifice, but one kind of sacrifice is like the sacrifice of a mother, who gives birth. You're giving birth to yourself, and in giving up your lies, your pretenses, your selfishness, in order to bring to birth something better and something that serves you better, while animal sacrifice is just designed to funnel everything to one ultimate apex predator. And now I want to say goodnight to all you beautiful, happy people with your shiny, happy faces. I love you all.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.